The morning began in silence, just as it had the day before and the day before that. The kind of silence not born from peace, but from emptiness. The kind that presses against your chest like a weight you can't shake. She sat on the edge of a cot that wasn't hers in a shelter that rotated beds every night, where the only constants were fluorescent lights and the cold air that seemed to leak through walls meant to hold in warmth. Her hands were folded in her lap, motionless. Her stomach felt like a hollow drum. 2 days since her last meal. The ache had faded into a numb hum now. Familiar, in a cruel way. Around her, other women stirred, gathering their few belongings, preparing for the day ahead. She moved slowly, her limbs protesting, each step through the shelter's hallway requiring willpower she didn't have but found anyway. Her backpack was already packed. It never truly unpacked. It held everything: spare socks, a photo of her mother, half a cracked bar of soap, a worn employee ID clipped to the strap. The logo on the badge had faded, the barcode nearly unreadable. But it still got her through the door. She left the shelter before the sun was fully up, her breath forming clouds in the early light. The streets were quiet, just the hum of streetlights and the distant growl of garbage trucks echoing through the city's arteries. Her bus didn't come on time. It never did. She walked the first 6 blocks to make up for it, the soles of her shoes slipping against frost-laced pavement. She kept her head down, hood up, arms pressed close to conserve what little warmth her body still held. By the time she reached the back entrance of the office building, the sun had begun its slow climb over the skyline. The security guard barely looked up as she scanned her badge and stepped inside. The warmth of the building hit her skin like steam, almost too much too soon. Her locker sat in a small, windowless room in the basement, wedged between a utility sink and a row of old, dented cleaning carts. She changed into her uniform quickly: navy blue pants, white polo shirt with a logo stitched in thread that had begun to unravel. She didn't have time to sit. She grabbed her mop, her gloves, her bucket, and rolled them down the hallway toward the service elevator. The first shift had already begun upstairs, executives sipping lattes behind glass doors, assistants bustling through emails, clients waiting in expensive chairs that no one like her was ever meant to sit in. The elevator dinged softly. She stepped in, pressed the button for floor 14, and leaned back against the wall, letting her eyes close for just a moment. Not to rest. Just to reset. When the doors opened, she was a shadow again, blending into the sterile brightness of the hallway, head down, silent. She began in the conference rooms. Wiping tables, straightening chairs, scrubbing coffee rings that had dried into symbols of neglect. Her body moved automatically, each motion carved by repetition. But the hunger pulsed louder now. When she leaned down to reach under the table, her vision blurred. Her hands trembled. She steadied herself against the edge of the table until the wave passed. At 9:17 a.m., the manager appeared. Clipboard in hand. Shirt tucked too tightly. Hair slicked with control. His shoes clicked sharply across the tile. He didn't greet her. He never did. He walked into the room just as she was finishing a window, and when he spoke, his voice was already annoyed. "Why are you so slow?" The words cut through the air with mechanical precision. No concern. No curiosity. Just judgment. She didn't turn around. Didn't answer. She just moved to the next panel of glass, the rag slipping in her hand from sweat and exhaustion. He shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and walked away. She stayed still for a moment longer than necessary, the rag now pressed against the same spot she'd already cleaned. Her knees trembled. Her lips pressed tightly together. She blinked once. Twice. Then resumed. She worked through the nausea. Through the cold sweat on her back. Through the voice in her head screaming for rest. Because rest was a luxury. Because stopping wasn't an option. Because food would come eventually. Maybe. She finished the floor by noon, returned to the basement, and sat in the break room, staring at a vending machine she couldn't afford. A coworker offered a snack from across the room, a small pack of crackers. She declined. Pride was all she had left. She leaned back against the wall, letting the chair support the weight her legs no longer could. And when her break was over, she stood. She picked up the mop, and she went back upstairs. The afternoon unfolded in waves. One floor after another, each corridor echoing with silence or distant conversation, the kind of corporate background noise that masked everything but exhaustion. She moved through it with mechanical precision, her feet dragging slightly more with each step, her hands slower now, fingers stiff from cold and overuse. The hunger had grown sharper, not duller, biting from the inside out. It curled in her belly like a fist, tightening every hour. But she didn't slow down, not because she could afford not to, but because slowing down meant drawing attention. And she had learned long ago, attention was dangerous. The 30th floor gleamed with wealth. Leather chairs, abstract art, marble counters that looked like they'd never been touched. She was careful here, extra quiet, extra fast. This was where the executive assistants sat, where glass walls separated pressure from opulence. She emptied the bins, replaced the liners, and moved quickly to avoid the glares from perfectly styled people who barely acknowledged her presence. Some stepped around her like a stain on the floor. Some looked through her like she wasn't even there. At 2:06 p.m., while wiping down a table in the central lounge, she stumbled. Just slightly. Her knees buckled for half a second before she caught herself on the edge of a chair. A wave of dizziness blurred her vision, and for a brief moment, the world spun like a carousel in reverse. She squeezed her eyes shut, grounding herself with breath. In. When she opened them again, no one was watching. The moment passed like a shadow. She resumed. At 2:34 p.m., she spilled a small amount of cleaning solution while refilling her bottle. It hit the floor and spread fast, a slow, translucent bloom against the tile. She bent to wipe it, moving too fast. Her head swam again. She leaned her forehead against the cart, gripping the edges to stay upright. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. She forced herself to stand. And then he came. The manager. Same clipboard. Same narrowed eyes. He hadn't seen the stumble, only the aftermath. The rag in her hand, the still damp floor, her posture just a bit too hunched. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask what happened. He just sighed, audibly, theatrically, as though burdened by the mere fact of her presence. She waited for the words, knew they were coming. They arrived exactly on time. "Why are you so slow?" She wanted to scream, not at him, not even at the question, but at the world that created it, at the fact that she had to choose between collapsing and working, at the system that looked at her empty stomach and saw laziness, at a life that had cornered her into invisibility, where suffering had to be swallowed because there was no room to spill it. But she said nothing. She bent down and wiped the floor until it gleamed. He walked away. She didn't cry. There were no tears left. Just breath, ragged and low, echoing in her chest like wind through a broken window. At 3:10 p.m., she passed the building's break room again. Inside, 3 interns laughed over lattes and half-eaten pastries. One tossed a sandwich wrapper toward the trash and missed. None of them noticed when she stepped in after they left and knelt down to pick up the wrapper. Inside it, a third of the sandwich remained, uneaten, untouched. She looked at it for a long time. Her hands trembled. Then she placed it gently in the trash and walked away. She would not eat from the garbage. Not yet. At 4:45 p.m., her shift ended. Her legs burned. Her arms felt like they belonged to someone else. But she changed back into her hoodie and jeans, stuffed her uniform into her bag, and walked back out into the city without complaint. The air was colder now. Wind pushed against her as if trying to send her back inside. But she kept walking, past the train station, past the diner, past the shelter already filling for the night. She didn't stop, because stopping would mean feeling, and feeling would break her. So she walked into the dark, stomach hollow, eyes dry, jaw clenched against the weight of what she could not afford to carry out loud. The sun had dipped behind the skyline by the time she reached the edge of the park, its last light bleeding through skeletal branches. The path was littered with dry leaves that skittered under her worn shoes, the wind tugging at her jacket like fingers urging her to turn around. She ignored it. Her footsteps were slow now, not by choice but by necessity. Each movement took effort, each breath a shallow calculation between will and weakness. She sat on a bench beneath a broken lamp post, light flickering above her like a nervous pulse. Around her, the city moved on without noticing. Joggers passed in pairs. A dog barked in the distance. The scent of hot food from a nearby vendor floated toward her on the breeze, wrapping around her senses like smoke. Her stomach clenched in response, not a growl, but a desperate folding inward as though it were trying to disappear. She closed her eyes. Let her head rest back against the metal of the bench. Let the moment suspend. Memories arrived uninvited. The sound of her mother's voice, soft but insistent, calling her to the table even when there wasn't enough food for both of them. The way her little brother used to sneak the last piece of bread into her hand and pretend he didn't want it. Nights when hunger was a game they tried not to lose. And the nights when they did. She had grown up surviving. She had never asked for ease. Just enough. Just enough to not feel this way. A couple walked past the bench, glanced at her, then quickened their pace. She didn't blame them. Her face was drawn, pale in the streetlight. Her clothes sagged on her frame, a silhouette carved from fatigue. To them, she was a warning. A story they didn't want to imagine could be theirs. She stood slowly, the stiffness in her joints now a constant companion. Her hands were cold. She pushed them deep into her pockets and left the park behind. She didn't know where to go. The shelter was full tonight, she had arrived too late, and the mat she usually took had already been claimed by someone else. The woman at the door had apologized, but there had been no solution. She wandered. Past bus stops. Past shuttered stores. Past windows full of warmth she could only observe from the outside. The world felt closed. She came across a small 24-hour laundromat humming under fluorescent lights. It was nearly empty, just the attendant half asleep behind the counter and an older woman folding towels slowly in the corner. She stepped inside, not to wash anything but to sit, to warm herself for just a little while. She found a chair in the back and folded herself into it, arms wrapped around her bag like a shield. Her head drooped. Then her body. Sleep claimed her not gently but fully. A sudden, involuntary collapse into the darkness. She awoke to the buzz of machines and the scent of detergent. The clock on the wall read 2:41 a.m. The attendant hadn't moved. She stood carefully, stretched quietly, and stepped outside. The cold slapped her instantly. She pulled her hoodie tight, shoved her hands back into her pockets, and walked. By dawn, her body had become a whisper. Her legs dragged. Her head pulsed. She passed a bakery with its lights flickering on, the smell of fresh bread coiling through the alley. She hesitated. Just briefly. The baker inside was alone, shaping dough with practiced movements. He didn't look up. She walked on. At 7:13 a.m. she arrived at work. Early. Before the manager. Before the assistants. Before the building filled with people who moved through it like they owned the air. She entered through the back. Changed slowly. Pulled her cart from the shadows. And began to clean. Not because she had strength, but because she had no choice. And when he passed her that morning, glancing down his nose with that same mechanical disdain, she braced herself. Why are you so slow? She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply wiped the floor. And whispered silently to herself, because I haven't eaten in 2 days. The hallway tiles glistened beneath her mop, a perfect shine broken only by the stagger of her feet. Her hands trembled with the weight of the handle, knuckles white, veins pressed sharp against skin drawn tight by hunger. Light from the overhead fixtures flickered softly. Shadows dancing across the polished floors. The building had awakened. Doors opened and closed with quiet authority. The aroma of coffee drifted from offices where warmth and breakfast were abundant. Laughter erupted occasionally behind glass walls, sharp, sudden bursts of a world she could not touch. She moved through it like a phantom. On the 15th floor, the trash bins were heavier than usual. Wrappers, cups, half-eaten meals. She emptied them in silence, lifting, twisting, tying bags with fingers that barely obeyed. Her breath came shallow. Her vision tunneled. Time slowed, then slipped past her. At one point, she stood too long by the window, the world outside stretching into morning haze. The cars below crawled through intersections. People lined up at cafes. She watched them with blank eyes. She couldn't remember how long she'd been standing there. A colleague passed and glanced at her. Not cruelly. Just briefly. A look that registered her presence, her stillness, then continued on. The absence of cruelty did not equate to kindness. She turned from the window and resumed. By noon, her knees buckled as she climbed the stairs, just 2 flights after a broken elevator call, but each step demanded more than she had left to give. She leaned against the railing halfway up, chest heaving, breath a whisper. The ache inside her had turned to something colder now, something heavy. It wasn't hunger anymore. It was vacancy. At the top of the stairwell, she steadied herself. She pressed her forehead to the cool wall for a moment longer than she should have. Then, slowly, she stood upright again. Her reflection greeted her in the chrome of the elevator door. Pale, hollow, defiant. She adjusted her collar, wiped beneath her eyes, and continued. In the executive lounge, she changed the water dispenser. Her hands slipped. The jug shattered on the floor. Water rushed across the tile like an accusation. She dropped to her knees instantly, grabbing towels from the cart. The manager appeared almost on cue, clipboard clutched, eyes sharp, voice louder than necessary. This time he didn't ask. He told her that she was being watched, that her performance was unacceptable, that she needed to move faster. Faster. She nodded, not because she agreed, but because arguing required calories. And she had none left. He walked away, footsteps echoing like punishment. She stayed kneeling, drying water with shaking hands, tears hidden behind the soaked towels. Her body was collapsing in slow motion. And no one saw. Or if they did, they pretended not to. Because to see her suffering would mean acknowledging the systems that made it possible. At 2 p.m., she excused herself to the restroom and sat on the closed lid of a toilet in the last stall, letting her head fall against the cold partition. Her arms ached. Her legs twitched. Her stomach had long gone silent, now replaced with numbness. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just breathed, until the silence in her body matched the silence around her. Then she stood again and went back to work. At 4:55 p.m., she replaced the last liner, stacked the mop against the wall, and returned to the basement locker room. The uniform came off. The hoodie came on. Her backpack over her shoulder felt heavier now, though it held nothing more than it had that morning. Her footsteps echoed through the hallway as she made her way to the back exit. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised gray. The wind cut through her clothes. Her limbs resisted movement. She made it 3 blocks before she stopped, sat on a curb, and dropped her face into her hands. She didn't want to keep going. But she would. Because survival wasn't a choice. It was a sentence. She sat for what felt like hours, her body curled at the edge of the street like a fragment discarded from something whole. The world passed behind her, cars and conversations, heels clicking on sidewalks, horns pressing through the dusk. She didn't hear them. Her mind had become a tunnel, dark and echoing, where the only thing moving was time. At some point, she stood. Not because she had the strength, but because sitting too long would mean not getting back up at all. The sky was nearly black now. She crossed the avenue slowly, arms tucked tightly into her jacket, and followed the sidewalk until it ended at the edge of an underpass where concrete pillars split the night into broken shadows. A thin trail of other discarded things lived here, blankets that weren't warm, tents that weren't homes, the smell of desperation too old to notice. She sat against the wall and pulled her knees into her chest. Across the street, a cafe stayed open late, its interior a stage of comfort, wooden tables, warm lights, soft laughter. Inside, a girl no older than herself sat with 2 friends, sipping something that steamed in both hands. A slice of cake sat between them. One of them pushed it forward. The girl shook her head, smiled, laughed. She turned away from the glass. Not out of bitterness, but because it hurt too much to look. The wind picked up, scattering paper wrappers and leaves down the road. She pulled the hood of her sweatshirt over her head and buried her chin deeper into the collar. Her stomach had stopped sending signals. It had accepted the silence. What remained now was the throb in her limbs and the distant, roaring ache in her chest, a mixture of hunger, exhaustion, and something colder, humiliation. She thought of her first day on the job. How she had stood tall, ready to prove herself. How she believed effort would be enough. That if she showed up early, worked hard, stayed quiet, someone would notice. Someone would care. Someone would say, "You're doing great." But no one had. Not once. The only words spoken to her in 3 weeks had been orders and corrections. And the same question over and over again, "Why are you so slow?" "Because I'm starving. Because I'm scared. Because I don't have anything left to give." She closed her eyes, the cold bleeding into her muscles. She thought of food not in the abstract, not in dreams of feasts, but in images that were ordinary. Toast with butter. A warm bowl of rice. A banana. A spoon scraping the bottom of a jar of peanut butter. The memory made her mouth fill with saliva, but she swallowed it back like shame. Someone passed her, looked at her, and crossed the street without hesitation. She didn't blame them. She probably looked like something dangerous. Something contagious. Something broken. She pressed her face to her knees, hidden from view. And for the first time since her first night without a home, she allowed herself to want. To really want. Not for money or comfort or miracles. But for mercy. Not from people. But from life itself. She whispered into her sleeves, into the folds of herself. "Please. Just one moment. Just one chance." The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts. She looked up. A woman stood nearby, not too close, holding a paper bag. Her coat was clean. Her eyes unsure. She extended the bag slowly. No words. Just the gesture. The girl stared at it. She couldn't move. Not out of pride anymore, but out of disbelief. The woman placed the bag gently beside her, then walked away. Inside, a sandwich. Still warm. Wrapped in wax paper. The smell reached her like a memory. She clutched the bag with both hands, trembling. And for the first time in days, she ate. Not greedily. Not crying. Just with slow, shaking hands. A bite. Then another. And with each one, something came back into her eyes. Something that had been pushed out by silence, by pain, by hunger. Something like life. The first bite didn't taste like anything. Her tongue was dry, her senses dulled from starvation. But by the third, the texture, the warmth, the faint salt of the bread and melted cheese began to break through. She ate slowly, deliberately, like the act itself was sacred. It wasn't just food. It was permission. It was proof that she still existed. The sandwich was gone too quickly, though she made it last as long as her shaking hands would allow. Her stomach didn't fill, it couldn't. Not after being ignored for so long. But the gnawing ache began to retreat, curling back into a quiet, tolerable emptiness. Her breath slowed. The nausea lifted slightly. Her head cleared, only barely, but enough. She sat there for a while longer, watching the traffic lights change without consequence. The woman who had given her the sandwich had disappeared into the night, not waiting for gratitude, not offering a lecture, just a quiet kindness, the kind that didn't announce itself, the kind that lingered without weight. Eventually, she stood, and this time her legs didn't shake. She still felt weak, still cold, but there was a flicker inside her now, a fragile glow of energy returning like a long-lost echo. She walked, not quickly, not with purpose, but with presence. The streets were still half asleep, but something had shifted in how she moved through them. She passed people who didn't look twice, past signs that no longer blurred. She remembered where she was again. The map of the city, which had collapsed into darkness days ago, began to reform. She knew these corners, these alleys, this broken fence behind the shelter, this mural above the stairwell. She made her way back to the building. She wasn't due until later, but she needed to go. Needed to clean something. Needed to prove to herself she could. The basement was silent, dimly lit. She changed slowly, tying her shoes with numb fingers, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. In the mirror above the sink, she caught her reflection. Still pale, still sunken, but the eyes had returned. Not fierce, not triumphant, but alert. She pulled her cart from the corner, filled her bucket, and climbed the stairs to the second floor. Early morning sunlight spilled through the windows. Dust danced in the air. The hallway was empty. She began to mop, each stroke steady, each step deliberate. The floor gleamed where she passed. Her rhythm was slow but certain. She didn't try to speed up. She didn't chase anyone's approval. She just worked. And when the manager came in early, papers under his arm, he paused as he turned the corner. She heard his footsteps stop, heard the breath as he prepared to say it again. But this time she stood up straight. She looked at him, and he didn't say anything. For the first time, he didn't ask why she was so slow. Because something had changed. Not in him, in her. She turned back to the mop, and kept working. Outside the window, the city turned gold. And for the first time in 3 days, she smiled. Not because the pain was gone, but because she was still here, still standing, still moving. And sometimes survival looks like that. Just one foot in front of the other, with nothing but hunger behind you, and something like hope ahead.